Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. One of the challenges synonymous with industrial cybersecurity is that in order to properly defend the OT environment, you have to know it. You have to take that inventory of linked assets, API calls, and cloud connections. You also need to know where your priorities lie in addressing vulnerabilities and applying patches. And perhaps most importantly, you have to know what will and what will not work for your specific operating environment. According to Nozomi Network's February 2024 OT/IoT Security Report, manufacturing was exposed to the most common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVEs, in any other sector. Our industry realized a 230% year-over-year increase in this area. Addressing even a fraction of these CVEs would be daunting, which is why understanding your assets is so basic, but yet so vital in establishing priorities and implementing approaches best suited for your security needs. And according to the Cyber Risk Alliance's most recent ransomware report, selecting those approaches has become an area in which the industrial sector continues to improve. The report found that the number of mitigated ransomware attacks has increased due to a number of leading strategies. Atop the list is establishing data and system backups, which has been implemented by 33% of those surveyed for the report. Second was the implementation and execution of policies that directed how the enterprise will respond to attacks, including a disciplined adherence to not paying ransoms. The same number indicated detection and resolution capabilities that were made possible by a combination of frameworks, policies, and cyber tools. Finally, a healthy but lower number of respondents stated that insurance covered any costs associated with the attack. While identifying which of these might be the best approach is certainly up for debate, the key is that steps were taken and plans were executed to keep these businesses up and running in response to attacks that continue to flood our OT space. To discuss these findings and more, we welcome Jeff Nathan, Director of Detection Engineering at Netography, a leading provider of network security solutions, to the show. So, Jeff, first and foremost, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to Security Breach. Glad to have you.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So, the dialogue here between us sort of got started in talking about the rising complexity of a lot of these attacks. It doesn't seem like their tactics necessarily have really morphed that much over time, but the organizations themselves are getting more high speed, and definitely the way that they're going about trying to disguise their behaviors has gone next level. What are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of, are hackers really getting that much better? Are we kind of lagging behind on the defensive posture, or what's your take there?
I think it's maybe a combination of both those things, right?
Yeah.
I shy away from the idea of it being one or the other. As ransomware or as threat actors progress, naturally, they get to stand on the shoulders of those who came before them.
Yeah.
And attackers also leverage a lot of the beneficial research or the capabilities created by defenders. And you can't talk about ransomware without talking about the use of both Cobalt Strike and now Silver C2. So a lot of software is probably created with security software, in particular adversary emulation, is sort of created from the perspective of trying to help a company or groups assess. But there's naturally that double-sided, double-edged sword, if you will.
Yeah.
The tools can be used for benefit or for harm. So adversaries benefit from the research, and there's just so much more to try to protect. So I don't know if that were worse, but it's harder, and we expose more attack surface, and then measuring that, kind of separating the wheat from the chaff, the things that are actionable, gets hard. There's just more data in general and more background radiation. I mean,
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a clear answer. But it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B.
No, it makes sense. And that's similar to some other things we've heard before. You've mentioned a couple of different types of malware strains that are out there with Cobalt and some of the others. When it comes to the way that the hackers are implementing and going about getting that malware into people's systems, are you seeing certain vulnerabilities that they're trying to exploit more than others? Is there certain inroads that they're able to take advantage of that maybe we're not thinking of, we're not defending against well enough, that just keep popping up over and over again?
For this kind of questions, there's this tendency for us as people to want to find the single cause. This, what's the one thing that we can
Yeah.
focus on? And like, I'm just as susceptible to that as anybody else. Uh, on one hand, I want to say that the largest attack surface they're targeting is people. And
Yeah.
on the other hand, I don't want to put the burden on people who use the internet and computers to be responsible for the security of the whole internet
Yeah.
and the companies they work for. So I'm going to fall victim to that same thing a little bit here, because if people are a big attack surface, let's break apart the technical sort of attack surface. At least a lot of the stories that we're reading about, the one of the inciting incidents, how you and I came to speak today, Jeff, was a scattered spider was sort of a backdrop for that. And I don't know that it was particularly unique. When I say was, I think that we're talking about just the combination of events, the big ones, the Caesars, MGM, and all the stuff that got written about. But as an org, they seem to make use of attacking the people, and infamously MFA fatigue attacks and the whole spectrum of authentication stuff. So on one hand, there's this tendency to just blame all of authentication and say, well, if we just fixed auth, people who were really good at, or good enough, boy, this plays back into your first question, were good enough at social engineering attacks. And I'm not casting aspersions at the abilities of a threat actor. At least that's not always the wisest thing to do. But if we, it's very tempting to just focus on the off piece, and that's kind of fair. If I can take a quick digression here, I think it's more, if there's a recent vuln that leads to RCE where you can, through remote code execution, gain that initial foothold and do that, absolutely. But those have kind of a sliding window of effectiveness,
Yeah.
kind of revealed over time. And the rest, a significant majority, I think, still lives with the people side.
Now, you bring up a lot of great points there, Jeff. We'll try to compartmentalize these, but they all bleed together eventually. You know, we started talking about the complexity of these attacks, and you illustrated that perfectly because it all morphs together. And one of the things you brought up there is about the multi-factor authentication and the whole element that people then play in that process, either embracing it or not embracing it, which oftentimes can lead to those being a vulnerability in and of themselves, depending on how they're set up. So I'd be really curious to get your take a little bit now. We're telling folks double factor, multi-factor authentication, protect your logins, more complex passwords, all that stuff. But going back to Colonial Pipeline, that was the first one where they got people's credentials and they were to log in. We saw more recently, you know, you mentioned the Caesars attack and the MGM attack. Even with the recent attack on the PLCs with Unitronics, it was because there's a default password that was still being used. What are you seeing there? How do we... It seems really simple, right? Hey, folks, do it better. But what's the reality of there? What have you seen maybe in trying to help people really realize the role they play in cybersecurity and the far-reaching impacts it has on an individual level?
All right, from the people perspective, I think people are put through a lot of training in their companies. They naturally are given, the larger the company, the more training you receive, and you're given this relatively sophisticated training to try to, you know, give you the 2020s or 2024, 2023, whenever version of security and safety starts with you, like the World War II posters, loose lips, sink ships. And again, we're sort of putting that on people. But when we're engaged in our daily lives, we're not really thinking about how the click relates to a misclick leads to access. But that's also not really reflective of what's happened in some of these cases. Let's take, I think it was one of Caesars or MGM was MFA fatigue. And so let's put ourselves in the shoes of the average person. And let's be even more specific. there are accounts within a company of differing value. And obviously, the more access someone has, the more value that has to the attacker, especially if they want to engage in ransomware and move laterally with a company. Or let's even be more generic. Maybe ransomware is one of many potential end games, but first they might want to explore. Maybe there are rather than just the encrypt and exfil or the encrypt in place, the in situ version. Maybe ransomware is sort of later down the line and they're just kind of exploring in a company. So the more access they can get off the bat, the better. So there's this people throughout a company are using MFA in most companies, but the people who are targeted by these MFA fatigue attacks are may not be the most sophisticated, but are probably sophisticated enough that if they were at their best, if they hadn't been sleeping, or if they hadn't been living their daily struggle, if they were given the moment to just think another few seconds, they probably would have behaved differently.
Yeah.
But one of the hardest things is that part of the success of any social engineering attack, it works because we feel some kind of time pressure. We feel this emotional response to do something. And these emotional responses are actually a huge part of how these attacks work. So if it's an MFA fatigue attack, your phone is blowing up and you might think it's an emergency. So you might be inclined to just make it shut up already by tapping the button on your phone. And when it's the individual whose individual machine has been affected by ransomware, or is in the midst, maybe it's not ransomware, maybe it's just some other scam, like a fake tech support scam or just anything. Yeah, fake tech support scams are pretty decent examples. You think your machine's infected, you think your machine is somehow misbehaving, and the answer is to quickly interact with these people who act like they're there to help you, or they're warning you of this impending doom and you have to act right away. So our emotions play a part in that, but they also play a part in another aspect of this that we're not thinking about. Not all MFA is phishable, but most of it is. Almost the MFA used by your bank, the MFA used by your credit card, the MFA used by the major technology companies that you use. The default mode, and almost all of them, is phishable, using adversary in the middle. You log into the fake site, and it's so let's go through that, like our feelings about that too. Feelings maybe is not the right word, but sort of our psyche, how we become conditioned. If you're used to logging in and there's this extra step, well, if you expect it and the fake site that you're interacting with, or the fake whatever the thing you're interacting with goes through the same workflow, you're likely to do it. So there's this kind of leads us to this destination that says, in our desire to build more security into things, we've conditioned people into behaviors that we've conditioned people to proceed with a thing they think is part of security when it might not be.
Yeah.
And in which case, we have to ask ourselves, have we actually added more security?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, and that lends back to the two basic principles here. Again, this is a complicated attack when you're looking at credential harvesting off of a multi-factor authentication platform. But at the same time, it's the blocking and tackling. It's making sure that that site that you're going to authenticate your information is the right one and that it's valid. It's looking at all the different elements to that. Where did the link come from? What site are you actually on? Even though it looks exactly the same, are you looking at the URL and all those other things that we have to train people to pay a little bit closer attention to? Because I think for so long, and you mentioned time sensitivity in manufacturing, for our audience, that's what it's all about. It's about staying up. It's about getting product out the door as quickly as possible. So it is breaking down a paradigm shift there. It's sort of using the paradigm they operate in against them, and then having to shift again a little bit to take time and slow down to look at all this stuff properly.
Absolutely. Jeff, a little while ago, you brought up PLCs as part of an attack, as part of a broader attack. And this is another thing I'm not an expert in, but super interested in, is OT, sort of all things ICS. I like gadgets. I like sort of playing with that. And without displaying too much of my own ignorance here, I imagine that I imagine that specifically in OT environments, there are the same kind of complexities that we had in things that are more mature now, but had to go through this process of becoming more mature. And so we think about, for example, the phrase that is often thrown about in cybersecurity or infosec is the blast radius. We're trying to limit
Yeah.
the blast radius of any given attack. And so one of those approaches in sort of cloud environments are credentials that have like limited scope, these service credentials. And as OT environments advance, as they evolve, that is part of how that is part of limiting that blast radius. But it's not sort of a one piece fits all, because there are all these other pieces that seem to be part of like how people are supposed to build OT networks. And your audience might laugh at me because someone who doesn't have this deep bench of OT experience, I read the Purdue model and I got the sort of the academic how this is supposed to be. But there's this intersection where OT environments kind of look like IT environments, and it's pretty hard to get away from this idea that there are ultimately going to be these crown jewels, these places that
Hmm.
that represent this interaction. Maybe it's a proxy or a jump box that's used to go from an outside network into these other deeper parts of a network. Or maybe it's where, like the historians, where a lot of important records are stored, and that could give an attacker kind of a map and on what it looks like to move through an OT network. But the limiting the blast radius is a thing that seems to have worked, seems to,
Yeah.
when employed properly, can can um, can make this harder. And yet we know those things exist, and it's still a thing that companies face. So it's by no means a magic. It's by no means a magic shield of protection
Yeah.
somehow.
No, it's interesting. The blast radius is a huge concern in the OT environment for manufacturers and in the industrial sector as a total, especially when you get into critical infrastructure and a lot of the networks that are in place there. And I think the big things that we hear a lot about are segmentation as a strategy to help control some of that blast radius when folks get in there. But also, it's a lot of, again, I hate to beat this term up, the simple stuff, the blocking and tackling in terms of getting an inventory of all your connections, which is a huge challenge for manufacturing because we're implementing all of this automation. And we also have this dynamic where we want to share as much data and information with everybody as we possibly can to help empower greater decision making and faster and quicker decisions. But we don't always have to do that. Again, from a security perspective and trying to control some of that, it kind of feels like it comes down to setting priorities and identifying what makes the most sense, but in a different thought process than what we're used to.
Yes,
Yeah.
now we're sort of an improv group. You kind of you laid out the first scenario, and yes, and I brush my teeth while standing on my head. But the version of what you sort of said was, I got blocking and tackling, uh, of course, network segmentation, all of the above. I have a few hypotheses on a couple of these things um, that OT attacks begin in the IT domain because that's the interface that people use. And so it's by no means is it enough to just say, well, we'll solve our OT problem by doing a really good job of IT. But it certainly doesn't hurt. But there's another thing. As people, we have tendencies. So in a manufacturing environment, you might need to measure a million things. Um, and that data then feeds back into changes or things that might interrupt your production process. Your giant presses or something. I don't know. They have these giant molds or something, and they're forming metal, and those fatigue, and those things need to be changed out every so many cycles. So, with that in mind, there is this concept that data that isn't collected can't be lost in ransomware or can't be lost in a breach. And so some of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, how important is this data to our actual business
Yeah.
function? How important is this data to this part of the manufacturing process? And to make that judgment, because, if some ransomware attacks just are like a machete, they encrypt data, and then exfil that data, or they leave that data in place, and then you kind of have to pay for it to get it back. But Um, there's lots of data that is when in one when locked down, when inaccessible. The real impact is to just the company affected. It has no value outside the company. It has no value from PII perspective. It has no competitive intelligence to either a foreign adversary, be that a company or government. So um, that is not an easy balancing act, but there's also the concept of how much of that data needs to be in such a way that it is accessible through paths from the outside or even from the inside. I mean, I guess there's this idea that some of this data is useful for a very specific set of metrics. And what's its life cycle? How long does it stay around? How do you get rid of it? Is it only valid for a day? Is it just a difference? Is it a measurement between two things that by itself is of no value? I don't think that that changes the tactic of the attacker, because if they're going to just engage in some automated ransomware process, it's not like there's a value judgment occurring by the ransomware. It says, "Oh, does this look like good data or bad data?" No, they
Yeah,
want all of it.
yeah.
But at the same time, maybe it shouldn't be collected in the first place at all.
Well, that's an interesting point. We talked about prioritizing stuff, but also just identifying the value of it, and that's how we can sort of establish those priorities and allocate our defensive assets in the correct way. And especially when we're talking about the amount of money that needs to be spent on cybersecurity and allocating those funds and getting approval for them. I want to bring up another point here. Visibility has become a huge priority now in the industrial sector because, again, all these connection points, growing attack surface, all of that. What I'd like to get your thoughts on next, Jeff, is, again, we keep talking about blast radius and trying to control things. What types of tools, I guess, have you seen been most effective? There's just been this proliferation of different options out there right now, which at times can be really confusing, especially as we're sort of in the infancy when we look at OT-specific cybersecurity. So could you give us some thoughts on the types of tools maybe we should be looking at to best ward off some of the attacks that are coming our way?
Post Snowden revelations, it's not a surprise to anyone that we learned that we often think we sometimes overlook what it actually means for our device to be compromised, whether that device is your phone or your computer, because all the encryption built in on our devices, it only works because of the point at which the attacker is observing that data. If they're observing the data between two other endpoints, uh, they're going to have a much harder time seeing the encrypted data. But once they're on like your device or a device, and they're looking at the traffic related to that device, they can see the data before it's been encrypted. There's a great likelihood. So um, when it comes to sort of tools that talk about that, that when it comes to tools that compensate for that, it's tools that are detecting behaviors despite there being a lot of encryption on the wire from the network side, or tools that live on those endpoints. Well, I can talk about one more concept there that people usually don't think about, but tools that observe the behaviors on the endpoint such that various attacks, either the way they manifest themselves on the endpoint, and even living off the land attacks have some footprints, or that their network-based communication is manifested despite there being some encryption. So, looking at from the network side, obviously, traffic like NetFlow has been around for a very long time. DNS as a data source is very powerful. Naturally, DNS is a bit of a complicated bag of answers, because DNS has been moving to use different ways of communication, DNS over TCP or DNS over HTTPS, and so now those exist in an encrypted domain. And um, I guess maybe to take a step back here, there's a bunch of ways companies can look at, if we focus on the network just for a second, there's a bunch of ways companies can deal with this. From the IT perspective, they might decide to interpose themselves with all the TLS traffic, creating potentially a vulnerability insofar as decrypting all that TLS traffic before it leaves their network. The traffic that they couldn't decrypt for whatever reason, they might decide to sequester, block, or do something else. But then once they decrypt it in transit, they inspect it, re-encrypt it, and send it on. That's not unheard of. It's done quite a bit. It sort of changes the game a little bit in cloud networks where both sides are using encrypted traffic and they're sort of they mutually have keys. That's the MTLS version in the cloud. But that's a big, complicated mess and is doable. But the larger the company, the harder that becomes. And the more diverse the number of things they're using, the harder that becomes. And depending on if they are a big OT environment, that probably becomes darn near impossible just because of how much compute is there on certain networked devices. So one of the other techniques then is to sort of do the equivalent of, I'm trying to remember what the FBI calls this. I think they call it a pen register. So instead of sort
Okay.
of getting the context, the who's actually talking on the phone and like a wiretap, they get the who called who. And in the network universe, that's flow, and that's the records of, yes, who talked to who and for how long, and maybe
Hmm.
how much data was
Okay.
transferred over how many packets. And that's sort of a technology that's been long used by network service providers or backbone
Yeah.
companies, but a little bit less so in the enterprise and perhaps the OT environments. But it is a place to observe and see how things are manifesting themselves on the wire. And you may not call it a natural outlet of encryption, but it's sort of an understandable place for people to turn if there's just too much encrypted data for them to reliably do sort of a packet level detection of things.
Interesting. Encrypt. We always talk about securing the endpoints. It's a huge deal in the operational technology environment, but not necessarily encrypting that data. So that's an interesting focal point that we might want to look at moving forward. That's something we haven't talked about. So interesting point.
I don't know if it's possible. Like, people have talked about encrypted data, the data at rest for the data in transit, but the number of ransomware attacks we see in
Yeah.
places that might have been able to do it, it may be an intractable problem. I hope it's not, but I don't
Yeah.
know.
Very interesting. Well, as we look ahead here, and we've been talking about a lot of different stuff, this is usually one of the questions I ask towards the end, but I'll throw it in here. What are some of the other bigger trends that you're seeing right now in cybersecurity, either from an offensive or a defensive perspective?
Oh my gosh. That's such a great question. When people talk about responding to something that happens in security, people have been companies, people, there's a lot of effort focused in any company on what happens when they see some kind of incident, some kind of potential incident. And we've seen an evolution over a long time over trying to do different things. How do we how do we decide how do we decide how to spend the few resources we have when we think a thing is happened? And one of the things we're observing then is a whole bunch of different approaches in how to do that activity differently. Some approaches, a few years ago, for example, we saw an argument that said we're going to try to automate some of that, not the resolution of what happened, more all the earlier steps. And that's the SOAR stuff, the security operations and automated response. I think that's what that was, the phantoms of the world and their competitors. And so they would take some alert from your security device and then add some more data to it and maybe automatically go create a ticket in your ticketing system and then bake all that data together. And then by the time someone came along, they would do a better job of being able to get to the bottom of it. I don't know that that moved the needle much, but I think that that was probably put together with a deep understanding of how a SOC, pretty deep understanding of how SOCs work. And I don't think I'm going out too far on a limb here by saying I'm pretty sure people in SOCs are still measured. Their performance is still measured by the number of potential incidents they close, number of tickets they close. If I'm being unfair, please at me. I would deserve it. But as long as that's the case, we might be creating perverse incentives and achieving perverse outcomes. So now we're still seeing some of that, but now maybe people are asking some better questions, which is if we're going to try to if we're going to try to invest human resources to go human capital, human resources, if we're going to invest human capital to go figure out what was the meaning of a potential incident, we should probably do a better job in two ways. First, figuring out whether or not that actually meant something. So instead of trying to annotate that ticket with as much context information, maybe we should instead try to prove it false. The whole security industry is really bad at this. We are not scientific. And so on one hand, I want to say that an upcoming trend in security is that we are thinking more scientifically. Instead of trying to prove things work, we're trying to prove things don't work. And by trying to prove things don't work, we're anticipating, we're thinking around corners. We are being the devil's advocate. We're doing using alternative analysis to uh, um, to do a better job when we're looking at a particular incident. I think we're doing. I think there's some companies doing that better, and what they're and trying to then say, uh, we have first done everything we can to automate that first part of the process, but they're trying to prove that it actually was bad. And even though that sounds even though that sounds maybe really bad, or maybe it sounds much like the same, what if that's half the equation, let's say, or maybe that's even more the equation, is the human capital that has to be invested in. Uh, I see that as a trend. I see that companies are still, the trend line is simply the companies are trying to give more tools to SOCs, but I think that the smart one is trying to automate the falsification. I don't mean like making things up. I mean prove things false. Making that scientific. But the other side of this is then distinguishing between an event and an actual compromise. And so I think that is like an advance that companies in the defensive security game are trying to do too. They're trying to say, instead of telling you like your NDR network.
Sure. You mentioned human capital there a lot, and that's an important part of manufacturing. And we look at specifically the OT environment, a place that we're really struggling is finding more cybersecurity specialists that are looking to get into the manufacturing field. There's something like 500,000 unfilled positions over the next 10 years that we're looking at there. We know there's no silver bullet for any of this stuff, but do you have any thoughts on some ways that we might be able to attract more people into these types of roles?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love this question so much. I wish we had more time because I think that half million number, I have suspicions about it.
Yeah.
I in my life, I try to interact with a lot of people trying to get into cybersecurity. And so when it comes to finding people in the manufacturing space, I think that one of the hardest things for anyone working in technology to cope with is that you could go your entire career. Maybe you're a programmer, maybe whatever you do, you're a sysadmin. Everything you've ever worked on, you can't see it, you can't touch it. And one of the amazing things about working in manufacturing is the end product you can see and touch. Maybe it's a raw material that's used in a product later on. To me, I mean, that might be the difference between, like, I don't know, am I living in a simulation or not? Because if I can touch it, I mean, maybe not, maybe that's a terrible
Yeah.
example, but there's something really attractive to me about working, about the idea of being able to touch and see. And as people are trying to make it into their field of cybersecurity, I have to believe that the idea of seeing a gadget, or not just seeing a gadget, if that's just one piece of it, but also present this as, this is largely green field. You the OT environment and its overall sort of security posture, of course, benefits on all the work that was done on the IT side, but is just unique enough that it's still very in its early stages. And this is a place where people getting into InfoSec for OT can blaze that trail. They can define what it's going to look like in the future. They can find new vulns. They can invent new ways of building better detectors, better mousetraps, and then advance the state of security for OT. So sort of coupled together, I guess I would add one final thing about this. There's a tendency for people to be over specialized, especially when they're coming into the field. They may be attracted to uh, attracted to capture the flag tournaments because they heard, and I want to learn to break into things. Maybe they don't have the skill set for that, or maybe they're attracted to this concept of threat hunting but have not the first clue. Um, there are people out there who talk about hiring and talk about how they found some amazing people, and and I think that maybe just thinking differently about your hire, uh, people, the larger the company, the bigger the opportunity they have to mentor. Small startups do not. You have to hire, you have to execute right away. But a larger company has that chance to mentor and grow someone into the role. And maybe thinking about what your hiring practice is like and thinking about how you're assessing those candidates and how close they get. One of my oldest friends in security is a guy named Daniel Clemens. Dan I met him at my second black hat ever. Dan's a pretty bright guy, and the way that he talks about how he's grown his company um, is trying to is trying to sort of is trying to acknowledge his own biases in hiring and finding people who seem like they have more of the capability, if not when they don't necessarily have the skills there. Because if anything, 10 years from now, the state of OT is going to be different than it is today. But the fundamental things that we learn form the tools we use in our problem solving, and the broader and the deeper that skill set, the better we are at facing those new technologies. And it's also just super exciting to have the chance to learn new stuff. And the people who come into these roles, if they're at the beginning of their career, they're not going to come in completely ignorant. They will have touched something or played with something that has been out of the purview, maybe because there's this giant age gap, whatever it might be. It isn't just a one-way street of mentoring them and you sort of build them up to how you need them to be. That's a total two-way street, and it's bilateral. I don't know if that's enough of a hand wavy answer, but I don't think there are actually 500,000 infosec jobs to fill. But I think there are thousands of people who want to get in the field, and a big part of it is just giving some of them a chance, even if the only thing that they've got on their resume is they seem to be driven. They've worked a couple basic jobs and they've got some certification. I mean, if we don't start adopting people who are earlier in their career, I don't see how we start filling some of those positions.
No, Grant, I think you bring up a great point in terms of working in an industry where you can see what you're impacting in terms of the end product. That's a great point. Got to get your thoughts on this, and the answers that I've gotten in this one just are all over the place, really range the spectrum from everybody saying it is an immediate, right now topic we need to address, to others are saying people are overreacting to it. And that's artificial intelligence and the impact that it's having on cybersecurity. Again, the responses have ranged. I'd be curious to hear what you think in terms of its impact. Who does it benefit more? Good guys, bad guys?
Column A and column B. I think I know we're close on time, so I'll say it this way. I fall into the camp of deep concern. I think it does amazing things from a code auditing perspective. It's unbelievably helpful, and I still do some of that work. But I think there are more people engaged in AI and ML research who approach it seeing primarily the benefits, or think that the potential uses by attackers, the misuse, the maluse, the weaponization, disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, all of those like misuse cases, I kind of put them all into that bucket of misuse. I think that they don't think that those are the sexy problems, and or they think that it's someone else's problem to solve. From a computer science researcher perspective, I don't think that people think that the misuse case is the hardest problem. There's there the a ML researcher named Robert Miles once said, if you're not working on the hardest problem in your field, why not? And he thinks that the safety and misuse cases are the hardest ones. So for people engaged in sort of research, it's awesome. It's a powerful tool. It helps you save time, but and to be fair, companies are hiring, for their red team. They're hiring they're hiring like MLAI red teams to sort of break the machine. But I think they're coming at it. I think security has been up until now an afterthought, or the misuse cases have been an afterthought, and what we have seen with these successive releases of some of the large language models, I think that there has been a bit of a miss in anticipating how they'll be misused. And if we don't invest more resources, we're going to be in a bad spot for a while. I don't know that it's going to kill humanity, because I don't think we're there yet in terms of its reach, but in terms of a world where we depend on the accuracy and reliability of information to sort of know what's real and to make decisions. I don't know that we're ready for all of the misuse cases, and I don't know that the investment in the potential harms reflects people's concern for that.
So we've talked about a lot of challenging stuff here, and I think in cybersecurity there is a tendency to gravitate towards, well, the more headline grabbing things, the ransomware attacks, the malware drops, and all the negative stuff. You're involved in this every single day. This is what you do, and you've been involved with it for a while. What helps you sleep at night? When you think of the state of cybersecurity right now, what gives you some reassurance that when you put your head down at night, you feel like things are under control or they're going to be okay?
The InfoSec community is incredible. It's filled with all of these people who are tasked not through federal mandate, not through law. No one came and told them what to do. They are interested in the world enough that they have invested their professional lives and their time to make things better. And there are these pockets, these communities out there, these vetted communities where people get together and they share information. They work for competitors. They work for security companies. They work for manufacturing companies. They work for all these different companies. But regardless of the flag that their ship flies, they come together, they build trust relationships, and they share information, and they create opportunities and capabilities for companies to defend themselves. And when there's an emergency, they self-organize. When there's an internet scale event, they self-organize into working groups, and they share the intelligence, and they share their mitigation strategies, and they work together to make a better internet. And this self-organization, these communities, these alliances, built up over many years, and they continue to this day. And it is the fact that there are so many awesome people out there doing this work without accolades, not asking for any recognition, that do it day in, day out, and are just silently plugging away, is what helps me sleep at night, because they're incredible and they're just doing it. And without them, I think we would see a much more dangerous and scary world. And I'm just so thankful for them. That's what helps me sleep at night is, I guess, colleagues and people who I don't know or have never met, but are just out there doing the work and pushing the state of security forward, and actually trying to share what they've done to make it better for everybody.
Thanks, Jeff. And for more information on Netography, you can check them out at netography.com. That's netography.com. Thank you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Jeff Nathan, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.